I'm Eric Calperthwaite. I'm, among other things, on the conference steering committee and co-chair of the content committee. And it was my pleasure to reach out to Professor Reynolds, who will be on stage in just a minute, and ask him if he would be our keynote this year. A lot of you may be saying, well, why are we asking Professor Reynolds from the University of Tennessee to talk to us? He's the Beauchamp Brogan Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Tennessee, and he specializes in both the intersection of law and technology and constitutional law. In addition, he is a prolific author, and just a little side note here, he wrote a book called An Army of Davids. It basically says technology empowers the individual to be David versus, the government or large company Goliath. And I've spent the years since I first read that book telling everybody who works for me that book should be on their bookshelf. And this is not to promote his book sales, it's to help you guys. You should put that book on your bookshelf. He brings that unique perspective of law and technology and constitutional law to the stage today. He also writes the popular blog Instapundit, about 4.5 million visitors a month to that blog, so it's a small blog. Without any further ado, I'd like to ask Professor Reynolds to come up on stage.
Thanks, Eric, and I have to say it's perfectly fine to promote sales of my book. That's absolutely all right. Well, I'm here to talk. I have very limited background in computer technology, and what I have is utterly obsolete. I was in a computer science explorer post in high school. I programmed in Fortran and COBOL. I did stuff in batch processing with punch cards. It was a big advance when we had paper tape. And yeah, some people remember this, right? And everything was run on a UNIVAC 494, which looked like something out of Colossus, the Forbin project. Took up a gigantic room, whirred loudly, had the tape drives that buzzed around, and proudly proclaimed on the front panel that it was solid state. No vacuum tubes for us. So it was really, really cutting edge stuff even then. But since then, not so much. I teach internet law. I teach national security law sometimes. I have some overlap with this, but my technical expertise, I'm a user. And I don't really have anything to offer on technical security, except that it seems like it needs to be better. And I see not. I'm talking today about something a little different, which isn't technical at all, or I would actually describe this as sort of the social software. Society runs on software of a sort as well. Mostly I deal with law, which is sort of a lower layer. A higher layer is culture, and what people do, how they decide what to do, how they decide what not to do, is often driven by culture, and culture is often a lot more powerful than the law. There's no law requiring that people show up appropriately attired and with good personal hygiene. And yet all of you seem to have managed this morning because of the demands of culture, not the law. And that leads to my specific topic today on social software. And I apologize if this leaves a Blue Oyster Cult guitar riff running through your head all day, because the title of my talk is Don't Fear the Leaker. And in fact, I think instead of just fearing leaks and viewing them as always bad, we need to kind of find a way to institutionalize them, to have the culture decide what's good and what's bad in leaking, and that might actually in the long run be better for security in many ways. Where we stand right now is that organizations everywhere, but especially the federal government, but not only the federal government, have gotten too big to really police or control. There's just too much there to oversee. In fact, when the IRS scandals were coming out earlier this year, one of the defenses that was offered for President Obama by one of his defenders was, well, the federal government, it's just too big for the president to supervise or control or know what's going on. And that, of course, is entirely true. But it's kind of a problem, We live in a democracy, a democratic republic with a constitution. The government is supposed to follow the laws. It's supposed to follow the Constitution. If the president who's elected to take care that the law be faithfully executed can't know what's going on in the government, then how can that really happen? Well, if the president can't know what's going on in the government, if the president can't know what all the millions of people under him are doing, there's still somebody who does, and that is the people who are doing it. They know. It's impossible to do much of anything in the government without a lot of people knowing about it. Even if it's black, a lot of people know about it. One of the main sources, in fact, I would argue, of legitimacy over the past many decades is, in fact, the sense that if something really bad is going on, it'll probably leak out. Somebody will blow the whistle. We'll find out somehow. And I think that's often true. But for that assumption to be true, a few conditions have to hold. First, the people in the federal government, and remember, although I'm talking about the federal government mostly, this really applies substantially to other large organizations. The people in the federal government have to be generally ethical. Enough so that if something wrong is being done, they'll notice and care, and that there's a reasonable chance one of them will decide to say something. Second, the chances of successful whistleblowing have to be high enough and the penalties tolerable enough that ethical people will be willing to do so. If you're going to get shipped off to the gulag, as in the old Soviet Union, the rate of whistleblowing will be very low. No organization, not just the Soviet Union, likes a tattletale or a squealer, even when the squealer is doing the right thing. But there's a big difference between people being shunned or losing opportunities for promotion and facing criminal charges, IRS audits, or permanent unemployability. Right now, I'd say the pendulum probably swung or is swinging in the wrong direction on this. The administration has got a very extensive leak squelching program called Insider Threat, sort of like a mole hunt, which is designed to squelch whistleblowing. So is their policy of surveilling journalists. And in fact, when I was in New York over the summer, I talked to the general counsel of a really big media company who was talking about all the John Le Carre-like steps they're going through to communicate with sources indirectly and to make sure that phones aren't traced. And it's like The Wire. They got their burner phones and everything that they use. It's really unusual. And there was a recent report in the New York Times talking about this as well. It's making it very difficult to report on what's going on inside the government, and that is, I'm sure, entirely by design. But there's a price. To the extent these things succeed in cutting down on whistleblowing, over the long term, they make the government's operations less legitimate because they make it less possible for people in the public to say, well, if there was something bad happened, it would probably leak out, because it's less likely that it would. Now, it's true, of course, that leaks can do damage. It's not as if all leaks are good. And as I'll get to in a minute, not all leaks are whistleblowing. Not all whistleblowing is leaking. But it's also true that without at least the serious possibility of misconduct leaking out, officials are more likely to do wrong. The less leaky the government, the less accountable the government, the greater likelihood there's misconduct that we don't know about, and thus the less reason there is to trust the government. Of course, on the other hand, the riskier it is to blow the whistle, the more we can assume that when somebody does, they're serious and it's something important. This probably means there's actually an optimum level of leaking and anti-leaking and all of that. All I can say is it's doubtful that we're at that optimal level right now. I think if the government wants to be trusted, and given that according to the latest Gallup polls, it's trusted less than it was during Watergate, and in fact less than it's been since Gallup started asking the questions, maybe it should want to, then it needs to be clearly possible for people in the government who uncover wrongdoing to make that wrongdoing public. You've heard it. If you see something, say something. We hear that in Homeland Security context, but it applies perhaps even more so in terms of what our own government is doing. This is probably also a good reason, if we want trust, to avoid political monocultures in the bureaucracy. An organization that's composed almost exclusively of Democrats or Republicans is less likely to have people who are willing to leak against a Republican or a Democratic president. That makes for less trustworthy government, too. Beyond that, I think we probably should be talking, and actually I think people in the security community already are, about the ethics of whistleblowing versus keeping your mouth shut. Maybe we should even try to build a culture around appropriate versus inappropriate whistleblowing. Well, my favorite country star, he's sort of country rock here in Nashville, is Webb Wilder. And Webb Wilder says, "I can't predict the future, but I can take a hint." Here are a few hints about what that might look like. Not all leaks are whistleblowing. To be whistleblowing, a leak has to expose wrongdoing. If you expose secrets that aren't wrongdoing, it's just a leak. It's not whistleblowing, and it can be quite damaging. One example of this would be the New York Times story from about 10 years ago on the use of SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Transfers, to police terrorist money laundering. That got out. It did some real harm to the ability to crack down on terrorist funding, and there was nothing illegal going on. There was nothing ethically troubling about this, really. It was a news story, but it was a damaging leak. It wasn't whistleblowing. Some leaks are made out of spite or for political purposes, although sometimes those are still whistleblowing. Mark Felt, who was deep-throated in Watergate, had an axe to grind, but nonetheless, Watergate was still a real scandal. What else is involved in ethical whistleblowing? Well, I was talking last night to somebody, and I'm not prepared to say that Eric Snowden is a good whistleblower, but I am prepared to say that Bradley or Chelsea Manning is a bad whistleblower. And the difference is Manning leaked a bunch of stuff that she didn't even know what it was. And that can't be right. Snowden, as I say, I'm not prepared to say he's a good whistleblower, but he does appear to be leaking what he thinks is necessary to make specific points, not big document dumps. I think there's a duty to minimize harm. And in doing it, a duty to realize that you may not have the big picture, and that leaks that you think are harmless might be more damaging than you think. So there's a duty to be cautious. Another question to ask is, would the public care? If you're leaking things that the public would be upset by, you're whistleblowing. If you're leaking things that the public wouldn't care about or would approve of, you may still feel you have a duty to act, but you're not really acting as the public's agent here. You need to think, as I said, but I want to repeat, very much about the harm. There's a duty to be self-critical and careful. You may not know enough to appreciate the harm from your leaking, and so you need to be cautious with regard to that as well. Well, those are cautions, but nonetheless, I think that just as we train soldiers in their obligation to disobey an illegal order, we need to think more about officials and contractors' duties to speak out in the face of illegal conduct. In my area of the law, we have a concept called private attorneys general. Those are people who are pursuing their own claims, but who in doing so are also vindicating a public interest that may not be vindicated by the real attorney general. Whistleblowers, in this sense, could be viewed as sort of a similar function. We can't have an army of people looking over the government at all times for wrongdoing. We try, but we can't. But as I say, the people who are always there when the federal government is doing things are the people who are there doing things. We might even want to go farther than we've gone in producing legal protections for whistleblowers. We have right now the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989, which was recently amended, but it's been pretty narrowly incorporated or interpreted by the courts, and we may want to expand this somewhat. I don't pretend to know all the answers on this, but I do know that we have a couple of problems. One problem is we have a government so big that, by admission, the president can't oversee or control it, invested with a lot of power, even when it's shut down, and insufficient scrutiny. And I think that having whistleblowers able to come forward, having a culture of appropriate whistleblowing, is probably a good thing. What about when you get beyond the classified area? Well, there's lots of stuff in the government that's not classified, that nonetheless people don't know about and don't hear about. And one proposal I've actually made with regard to the non-classified parts of the government is to flood them with interns from high school and college. My theory is you put in all these naive and idealistic young people, and they'll know what's going on. If they see something that looks wrong, they're much more likely to talk about it, and if nothing else, people are likely to just worry that they're there. And who knows, maybe having naive and idealistic, fresh young faces around will just make people more guilty about doing stuff they shouldn't do. It's worth a try. It may even be that if we institutionalize whistleblowing somewhat, if we create a culture of appropriate whistleblowing, it may actually help security. Because the thing is, not all leakers are good. Sometimes they're noble. Many times they're sort of self-described crusaders on a mission that involves an exaggerated sense of their own importance. A culture that emphasizes when leaks are good and when they're bad might actually help with that. Now, I don't want to promise too much from all of this. It's only a modest improvement at best. Bureaucracies inevitably seek to conceal bad news like everybody else does. The cultures within them will inevitably tend to go along with that. And no changes are going to reverse that entirely or even mostly. But like I said, culture is a very powerful thing. This organization, the ISSA, has a culture of its own. People do things or don't do things within it, not because there's a man with a gun at the other end making them, but because that's the culture. Workplaces have cultures, governments have cultures, our nation as a whole, of course, has a culture, and people follow the commands of culture when they would cheerfully evade a law. So I think it's worth working on and thinking about changing the culture within organizations in ways that improve accountability and don't treat all leaking as always bad. And finally, that's the phrase that all speakers use that all audiences like the most. And finally, it's not like our current situation is all that good. We have leaks all the time, and yet at the same time, the government's bringing the hammer down, and people feel that the government's unaccountable. It's not trusted. Talk about these things. Maybe we can figure out a way of making things better. And probably, really, the title of my talk should have been Don't Fear the Whistleblower rather than Don't Fear the Leaker. But if I did that, you wouldn't have Blue Oyster Cult going through your head all day. Just be glad I didn't use Miley Cyrus. Thanks very much.